Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. It's true. We learn from history, and you're going to find out today that a lot of what is happening in the modern church was happening in the 1st and 2nd century. And John, if you could move it on, please. Karl Marx, keep people from their history and they are easily controlled. Never truer words said. History enables us to understand where we are and to therefore analyse where we're heading and not make the same mistakes again. A lot of people don't like history, and they don't like history because when they went to school they had to learn hundreds of dates. Okay? So in this 6-week course, there are only 4 dates we're going to be concerned with. Isn't that exciting? Only 4 dates. The rest of the dates were all there just to help us put things in perspective. 60 years ago this month, I first went to university. You went to lectures, because there weren't many things online, you had to be there, and you wrote your notes. Indeed, in English literature, a mate and I discovered there were different lecturers in the day course and the evening course. And so he would go to the day course, I would go to the evening course with a trusty bit of carbon paper. And so we had 2 lots of notes. When you were doing research for an essay, you went to the library, you got the book, you sat down and you copied what you needed to know. No such thing as a photocopy. And your essays were handwritten. None of those things exist anymore, and if they did, I wouldn't be able to read them anyway. Because I wouldn't be able to read my handwriting, although it was better back then. In 60 years, the world has changed dramatically. Now we're going to look at 1,500 years of church history. And here, around about 1440, Hans Gutenberg invented the printing press. So prior to here, to this whole period of church history, everything is handwritten. So when you write a book, you write it by hand, and if you want other people to read it, people copy it. And so a lot of what we're going to be doing, I'll say, it'll get really annoying, I'll say, we don't have any of this stuff anymore. So there are problems. Next one. Next one. There are problems. There are problems with manuscripts. The first thing is they weren't written on paper. There were a variety of different things used during that 1,500 years. A lot of it simply doesn't survive. So the paper itself, the writing material itself disappeared. They were handwritten and they were copied. Now you could actually read them because copyists really had good handwriting. They were expensive, so you didn't copy anything that wasn't important. William Barclay, in one of his commentaries, worked out that to copy a page of a gospel cost a day's wages for the ordinary person. A day's wage for every page is what it costs. So if you wanted to copy out Mark's gospel, I don't know how many pages that was in those days, but virtually you were using 6, 8, 9 months of wages to pay for the copy. Stuff gets lost. It gets lost because of natural disasters. The great library of the ancient world was at Alexandria. Now I've been to the library in Alexandria, it's magnificent, but it's all glass and steel. The wonder of the ancient world doesn't exist, nor does what was in it, most of it. It was destroyed by natural disasters. People move, and when they move, they lose stuff. We moved 4 years ago. We still can't find our wedding documents or any other family stuff. It's in a box somewhere, but who knows where. So things get lost. You have battles. And when you have a war, what you do is you try to destroy everything that belongs to the opposition. And so things get lost. And things get lost because you don't know what they are. Sounds strange. But there's a very famous incident where a scholar went to a monastery. And a monastery is a place where the monks read the Bible. And he discovered that they were wrapping their garbage in manuscripts that they'd found down in the dungeon. And so he was very interested to have a look, so he unwrapped one of them. And it was one of the earliest copies of the Gospels that we have. But you see, it was written in Greek and the monks spoke Latin. So to them, it was just something to wrap the garbage in. That's why things keep getting lost. That's why, for much of this period, we are actually discussing what we think occurred, given the evidence that we have. And that creates problems because what's going to happen is, I'm going to tell you something that's true, and somebody else is going to tell you something that's true, and they're going to be different. And it's simply because we're looking at it from different angles, looking at the evidence and interpreting it slightly differently. We'll come to a real instance of that in a few minutes. So, we don't have a lot of the manuscripts. The other thing is, because of the cost, you actually leave out anything that isn't important. So history is not like our history. If I'm writing a history, I want to put it into its context and I want to look at all the other things. I'm looking at an ancestor of mine. The last two biographies on him were written in the 19th century. And I think it's time for another one. Why? Because they don't answer any of the questions I want answered. I want to know how he got from where he lived into Edinburgh to go to church with John Knox. Did he ride his horse all the way around, get to Queen's Ferry and come in? That's a long way. Did he get his servants to row him across the Firth? Who knows? I want to know those sorts of things. But history is selective. That's the key term. History is selective. Look at the book of Acts. The book of Acts, chapters 1 to 12. Don't worry, I'll keep dropping those during the day. Chapters 1 to 12 is really centered on Peter. Chapters 13 to 28, Peter doesn't get a mention, or hardly gets a mention. They're all about Paul. Now, it wasn't that Peter wasn't around for chapters 13 to 28. It's just that Luke wasn't interested. Luke selects what he wants, and from chapters 13 through to 28, all he wants to talk about is what's happening with Paul and Paul's missionary journeys and so on. So it's selective. Now, I said there were only 4 dates that you needed to remember. The first one is around about 30 AD. It's the resurrection at the beginning of the church. The second one is 312, and it's the Battle of Wyong Bridge. Very important. But we'll discover that next week because we won't get to it this week. 571, 571 is the birth of Muhammad, which changes the whole landscape for the church. And then 1517, Luther's 95 Theses. Now, if you're an eternal optimist, we may get to that, but we'll see. That may have to be next term. They're the only dates that matter. because everything else stems from those. All right, let's look at the beginning of the church. Yep. Oh, sorry, keep going, I've just done that. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you to the very end of the age." Go into the whole world and make disciples. Next. Now, the whole world is the Roman Empire. Jesus didn't say go to China or America or Australia, where there were civilizations. All they knew about was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire of Jesus' day was essentially the green and yellow bits. These bits mostly came after Jesus' day. Still a big area when you don't have planes or cars or trains or any of those things. Christianity begins over here in this tiny area, which is really, as you can see, a backwater to the empire. Not central, Rome central. It's way over on the side. It's unimportant as far as the Roman Empire is concerned. But it begins here, and then, as Jesus commanded, it spreads out into all of these areas. Now, at various times we shall see that Rome is the centre, and then it declines, and Alexandria is the centre. Byzantium became Constantinople and is now Istanbul. That becomes the centre. They are the main centres of Christianity in the period that we're looking at. Thank you. Now, why did it happen then? I put on the thing, in God's good time. God knows what he's doing. First thing is the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was the first time in history that you could travel with relative safety. Now, under the Roman peace, you still had areas of difficulty, but basically it was peaceful. And so if the disciples wanted to go anywhere into the ancient world, they were actually protected by the Roman peace. The second thing, the Roman roads. John, if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, that's a Roman road, that's a Wyong road. That's 2,000 years old. Now the first thing about it is it's straight. As you can see, it's a modern picture. These are the old ruins there. They were built to last. Unlike us with all of our modern technology. It was easy to travel in the Roman Empire because you had these excellent roads. Now, they were pretty bumpy if you had a chariot, but you could walk them. Easy to walk because they were straight. And so it was easy to get to other places. Back to the previous slide, please. Common language. Greek was the common language in the first century. Everybody spoke Greek. The scholars, some of them would speak Latin. Latin was the language of official documents. And then everybody would speak their own language. There would be a local dialect. But if you spoke Greek, then you'd be understood. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek. It's not written in Hebrew or Aramaic or anything else. It's written in Greek because that was the language of the day. And so it was possible to move throughout the world and be understood. So it all happens at exactly the right time. All right, what do we know about the first church? Next slide, please. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now, this is the very beginning. The Christians meet together in homes. They are so close to each other that they actually sell what they have and they share everything. And any money that's left over is given to the poor. It's not a principle that would work today. I mean, if we all agreed that we get rid of our lawnmowers and only have one lawnmower, you'd never let me have it, because every time we use a lawnmower, I bust it. And then, if I loaned you my axe, and you didn't give it back straight away, then you'd be in trouble. But we just don't work like that. The early Christians were that close. Now note, their communion, their church service was a meal. Not something special, it was just a meal at home. They met in the temple courts, because they were all, at that stage, Jews who'd been converted to Christianity. You remember Paul on his missionary journeys always went first to the synagogue, and then when he got chucked out of there, to the marketplace to preach. That's what they did. So they had their formal meetings, and then they had their fellowship time together. All right, what about the disciples themselves? Peter was a fisherman, like his father. When he was called by Jesus, he was living with his wife and his brother and his mother-in-law. So much for celibacy. Was he the leader of the disciples? Don't know, but he certainly took the initiative in choosing the replacement for Judas. On the day of Pentecost, he was the chief preacher. He had a vision which launched the mission to the Gentiles in Acts chapters 10 to 12. But then when he was criticised by strict Jewish Christians, he wavered. And he was imprisoned by Herod Agrippa. And miraculously he escaped just prior to his execution. That's in Acts 10 to 12. After that, who knows? Legend says it was his preaching that was the basis for Mark's Gospel. There are two letters written by Peter. Well, we suppose there are scholars who say, hang on a minute, they can't be. Because 1 Peter is the best Greek in the New Testament, 2 Peter is the worst Greek in the New Testament. Now, I don't have a problem with it, because in 1 Peter, if you read at the end, it's by the hand of Silas or Silvanus. So he's the educated person that writes down what Peter tells him to write, and he tidies it up. 2 Peter is the writing of an uneducated fisherman. So he didn't have somebody to write it down. So I don't have a problem with that. He ended up in Rome, probably. Come back to that in a little while. He was martyred under Nero in 64 AD. He did not found the church in Rome, and nor did he, in my view, have any position of authority there. We'll come back to that in a minute as well. Around about 200 AD, however, a cult begins based on Peter. His grave, supposedly is the site of the Basilica in the Vatican. Directly of the popes with Peter, Pope Leo the Great died in 461. He's the one who really started that. Doesn't go back to the beginning at all. There were apocryphal writings. The Gospel of Peter was banned in 190 because it was heretical. The Apocalypse of Peter describes hell, and the Acts of Peter come from the late 2nd century. After Luke finishes with Peter in Acts chapter 12, we really don't know much. Paul, on the other hand, he's an apostle, not a disciple. Born in Tarsus, on the map that you've got there. Tarsus is sort of in a bit after Israel, a bit around there, you'll see it printed there. That's where he was born. He first occurs in the Bible in Acts chapter 7 at the stoning of Stephen. He was commissioned by the high priest to arrest the Christians at Damascus because he was a Pharisee, really good Jew. And he was converted on the way there. He begins preaching in Damascus, and then he disappears for a while. He's in Tarsus for 10 years. We know nothing about that 10 years. And then Barnabas brings him back. He brings back famine relief from the area, and he discusses the Gentile mission with Peter. And from that time on, we know what's happening because of Luke's writings. He goes on missionary journeys. I'll come back to the others in a minute, so I'll go to the next slide. Okay, now he goes on missionary journeys. And we know about these because Luke gives us a great deal of detail. And everywhere he goes, he preaches the gospel, and in most places he founds churches. Now, his first missionary journey begins up here in Antioch and goes around. The next one's the second missionary journey, and you'll notice from the second missionary journey now, he does a whole lot more and ends up over here in Greece and then back. Goes from Damascus, closer to the centre of things, up and around. Somebody on Monday said, did he walk all that? Yes, he did. And the next one, which is the third one, which takes virtually the same area. He does pretty much the same thing. And then the next one, you've got the map that you've got printed there, in which you've got his first journey, his second journey, his third journey, and then his journey from Jerusalem to Rome, where he is imprisoned for 2 years, and that's the end of the story. He's supposedly released from prison, goes somewhere else for a while, probably Spain according to tradition, and comes back to Rome and is martyred under Nero in 64 AD. His letters are well known, but he's not prominent. His theology is not prominent until Augustine in the 4th, 5th centuries. Now the other disciples, we don't need to go back in the slides, the other disciples, John, he evangelised in the province of Asia. He, of course, ended up on the Isle of Patmos in persecution under Domitian, and he probably dies there. Mark spends a fair bit of time in Alexandria. Thaddeus goes to Edessa, which is west of Syria and Antioch. Thomas apparently goes to India, and that's it. And all of that's myth and legend anyway. Now, it doesn't mean that the other disciples didn't work really hard to establish the church. It just means it's selective history. It's so costly to write history that you select it. And we just don't know what happened to them. Now, the Gospels. The Gospels were accepted from very early days, so it's important to understand how we got them. And what I'm going to give you is what most scholars accept these days as being the facts. I could give you a whole list of statistics and things. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to. Right, on Monday that happened at least 20 times. Let me rub a bit of this off. It's generally assumed that Mark was the earliest gospel. Mark is the shortest gospel. And it's generally accepted. You need water to rub it off, and then you can't write on it for ages. John's paper in short was much better. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. And it's presumably the preaching of Peter. That's what tradition tells us. Matthew and Luke contain virtually all of Mark. Mark forms the structure, and all of Mark, with the exception of a few verses, is there. Matthew and Luke both have bits that are the same that aren't in Mark, and the German word Quelle, which means source, is that. The assumption is that there was some kind of document around that they both drew on. And then they both have special Matthew and special Luke based on their interests. Most of special Matthew is the teaching of Jesus. So the Sermon on the Mount is part of that. Most people think that probably there was a catechism which had all of that sort of teaching in it, and that's what Matthew used. Because one of the problems is, did Matthew write Matthew's Gospel? If you read Matthew's Gospel, the conversion of Matthew is word for word from Mark. Now, I think if I was telling the story of my conversion, I'd probably use my words rather than the words somebody else wrote. But who knows? Who cares? They're the Gospels that are accepted and have been accepted right through church history. John is different. John is written much later. And it would appear John has Matthew, Mark and Luke, so he doesn't want to copy them. And so John's Gospel creates some problems in terms of order, because John's Gospel is written based on what he wants to teach. And so sometimes things are in a different order because they fit with what he wants to teach. We start this week a series on the I am sayings, which were very important in organising John's Gospel. They're the Gospels, and they have been accepted by the church since the end of the first century. And when we look at how the New Testament came into being, the thing that you will notice is that the Gospels are always there. The four Gospels are always there. There are other Gospels which are never talked about. And they're called the Apocryphal Gospels. And they set out to explain the things that the Gospels don't explain. Written much later, usually the 2nd century, there are 2 big volumes of them with commentary, which if you have insomnia is a good thing to buy and read, other than that. But they're very interesting. For example, all we know about Jesus is his birth in Luke, his presentation at the temple at the age of 12, and then he begins his ministry at the age of 30. What happened in the meantime? Well, the Apocryphal Gospels actually explain it. I mean, for example, in one of them, and I can't remember which one now because it's been a long time since I've looked at them, some of his friends start bullying Jesus. And so he turns them into stone. And they're actually stone birds, apparently. And then he breathes on them and they fly away. Now, that's the sort of stuff that's in them. It's obviously not the sort of stuff that is true. It's all part of the myth and legend of the day. All right, let's look at the features of the early churches in the 1st century. Do property, liturgy, uniformity, hierarchy, and scripture. First of all, property. Sorry, as the older I get, the further down that is. I'm convinced the floor keeps moving. The early church had no property. So the modern church wardens would breathe a sigh of relief and say, wow, wasn't that a good idea? They had no property. They usually met in private houses, or later, as the numbers got bigger, they hired public buildings. The first building that we know of that was built as a church dates from 232. So they met in houses and in public halls for a long time. If you go over there now, they will tell you, you know, this was the first church here, and it's been a church built on the side of a house that would have been the original house church. House churches are great because you're all together. It's really close and everything else. But when I was curate at Mount Druitt, they'd begun there by having church in the rectory while the church was being built. And it'd been a few years since the church had been built. But I can still remember the rectory kids complaining about Saturday nights when you had to get everything out of the lounge room, clean everything, and set it out in chairs for church on Sunday. And it was a real hardship. So, you know, there are advantages to having this kind of building. Liturgy? Well, I'm going to tell you what happened at the end of the 1st century, the 2nd century, and the 3rd century. But in the early church, it would seem that they continued to use the Jewish liturgy, all the bits that were relevant, parts of which are still in our preble. You don't recognise them, but they're there, and they come from the old Jewish services. The early church undoubtedly used those. Beyond that, most of what happened would have been local. No uniformity, which is going to come up next. Communion was mostly a meal, not a service. So in Corinth, Paul tells them not to be greedy when they come to communion, because it was a meal. Don't be gluttonous. There is no uniformity. Each church is independent, each church does its own thing. And the only interference comes when there are problems, like Paul at Corinth. There are problems there, and so Paul writes to them to try to deal with the problems and clean the problems up. Hierarchy? There is no hierarchy. Remember, Paul says, I'm an apostle, I could demand it, but I'm going to do that. I plead with you to do this. As the movement grew, leaders were appointed. And here's where we get into trouble. This is the point at which, if you're a good Anglican and you don't want to be upset, you go and make coffee. I am going to talk to you as a historian, not as an Anglican. Now, can I say that before I start, because I don't want to get people too upset, I actually happen to think that our form of church government is as good as any. But it's not biblical. That's why I don't give bishops the honour that they think they're due. And if I was asked to go and minister to a church in Scotland, in the Church of Scotland which doesn't have bishops, I wouldn't be at all concerned. And there's a reason for that. Episcopos, presbyteros, and diakonos. I learned years ago from Leon Morris, the great biblical scholar from Melbourne, if you don't understand what a word means, pull the Greek up, because nobody else will understand it either, and then you can say whatever you like. Okay. Episcopos, presbyteros, diakonos. Generally translated as bishop, priest, and deacon. And that's the threefold order that Anglicans have. Now, of course, the Catholics stuck the Pope up here, although not immediately. And you have bishop, priest, and deacon. Now, I don't have a problem with deacon. We'll leave that one because deacons were appointed in Acts chapter 7. We know about them. They're there to serve the meals and so on so that the apostles can get about teaching. What does the word episcopos mean? It actually means overseer. Not bishop, overseer. In the authorised version, it's always translated as bishop. And when we go through the rest of these two lectures, I will say, you know, Clement, the Bishop of Rome and so on. But we don't know that they were even called that because the documents are all in Greek and the word is episkopos. And those who translated them were those who, as I'll explain later on, were very keen to establish bishops, priests and deacons. But overseer could well be president, chairman, whatever. And anyway, in the New Testament, the overseer is the overseer of the local church. So Alex is the Bishop of Wyong.
The Episcopals.
I had a mate in college who became the curate at St Clement's Moslem, and I always used to introduce him to people as the Bishop of Taronga Part 2, because it was in his parish. It's the overseer of the local church. Presbyteros means elder. The word comes from old. So it's somebody who's old enough, mature enough, wise enough to be given some sort of leadership role. It comes to form the word priest eventually, but it means elder. And so you see, a church that isn't Anglican or Catholic has a leader, call him a rector, call him a pastor, call him a moderator, or whatever. You have elders who serve in the congregation and deacons who do the basic work. Now, down through time, that becomes set in a fixed position. And also, related to it is the concept of apostolic succession, which develops later, based on the idea that bishops are successors of the apostles, and in particular Peter. And so if you are not a church with a bishop as part of apostolic succession, you're not really a church. It's a bit tough if you're Presbyterian or Baptist or Methodist or Uniting Church. Any of those things. 1896, Pope Leo XIII released the papal bull. Now, the Pope is infallible, so you can't take it back. And he said, Anglican orders are, and I quote, absolutely null and utterly void. It's a papal bull. And he said that's the case because back in the Reformation, we removed from the ordination service the idea of a sacrificial priesthood. We got rid of transubstantiation, removed the idea of a sacrificial priesthood, we were no longer bishops. And what does that mean? When I was rector at Annandale, I had a couple of women visit wanting a letter about their marriage. I had to look up the register and write, they were married in this church by so-and-so. They'd lost their wedding certificate, and I guess they were too lucky to go to the registry office and get another one, but the letter was fine. Why did they want the letter? Because they were Catholics. They had enough of their husband, but they didn't believe in divorce. But if they were married in an Anglican church, they could get the marriage annulled. Technically, that is the Catholic position. Because of all of this. Now, I used to play squash every week with Father John Walsh, who was the Catholic priest in Annandale. I used to go and take Bible studies for him, and he preached in my church a number of times. He said, I hope they don't come to me with that matter, because I'll tell them that they're a joke. They're making a joke of me, they're making a joke of our church, and get out of my sight. But really he was wrong, because technically that is the position. I don't think the guys over there would believe that, but that's technically what Catholics believe. Now let's go back to this Pope and succession from Peter. Let me throw another spanner in the works. Tradition says Peter died in Rome under Nero. There is no evidence for Peter in Rome that really we can guarantee to be true. I have a problem. If Peter was the Bishop of Rome or the leader in the church in Rome, Paul was there for 2 years and he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and then he went away and then he came back and he wrote 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. They all have a list of greetings and never once is Peter mentioned. Now I know Peter and Paul didn't get on all that well, you've got to read Galatians to understand that. But if Peter was anybody of any significance in Rome, Paul would have mentioned him. So whilst I have no doubt that the legends are true that he was martyred in Rome, he certainly didn't have a position of authority there. So now I've undone all of the Catholic teaching. So, let me go back to what I began with. I think this is as good a form of church government as you can get. So I'm happy to have it. But if somebody asked me to minister in a Presbyterian church, it wouldn't bother me, there were no bishops. And as I say, that probably explains why bishops don't get what they think they should get from me. But anyway, it's another story. Let's go back to the previous slide, please. Scripture. They had the Old Testament. That was the basis of what they had. And then they had the letters of the apostles, Paul for example. When Paul wrote a letter to Ephesus, it would have been copied and then passed along to the other churches and read at the time that you had scripture reading. No concept of the New Testament at that stage. You have the Gospels, which is the basis, which are probably in place, apart from John's Gospel, by the end of the 50s. We don't know exactly, we don't have enough evidence for it. John Robinson, who was the Bishop of Woolwich, who was God is dead theologian, John Robinson believed that none of the Gospels were written in the first century. They're all later documents, you know, they've got no truth to them. Before he died, he got converted. And Edwin Judge, the professor of ancient history in Sydney in those days, in Macquarie, actually inherited his library. And John Robinson had come to believe in his dying years that the Gospels were earlier than any of the evangelical theologians believed. He believed the evidence showed that they were way back. But there is no doubt that by the end of the first century, the Gospels and the epistles are being read and circulated amongst the churches. So we come to the end of the first century. Maybe we should have coffee at this point. Stretch our legs. 10 minutes is all you have, all right? In my best school teacher voice, 10 minutes is it. And at the end of the first century, the church expands and expands rapidly. New converts, it's not just the apostles, new converts travel and informally share the gospel and people get converted. Literature is becoming available, expensive, yes, but the gospel and the letters are around, and the Jews are scattered. We'll come back to them in a minute, and they go into new places, and the Christians go in on their coattails, initially, not always. But we've got a couple of maps. I think I printed. First century churches. I need to tell you, Alex said he had to go. I said I was going to tell you he went because he was upset at what I said about bishops. I said I wasn't to do that, but now I have. First century, you can see that the church is all around the area where Paul travelled and up here in the peninsula. By the end of the second century, the church has expanded dramatically. And then is there another slide with, I can't remember, yes it is. Okay, so after the 3rd century, it expands even further, even up to Ireland and England. And next week we'll look at Christianity in Ireland and England. But these are all the main centres of Christianity. It's really quite incredible when you think about it, that in a short period of time, without any modern communication, the church expanded so quickly. Even more interesting, given that the church faced problems. Thanks, John. Jews, Romans, Gentiles, paganism, persecution. Problems. The Jews were a problem. The Jews are a problem everywhere. Nobody likes the Jews. And there's a reason for that. The Jews take seriously God's promises. God says, you are my chosen people. And they've taken that seriously. And so they are the only race of people in history who have been banished from their homeland, and spread out all through the world, and have kept their racial characteristics. Been banished in the 70s, come back to Israel in 1948, and they're still Jewish. No other race has done that, and it's because they actually take seriously God's promises. But the problem is they stay Jewish and they're successful. And nobody likes somebody who's not one of us who's successful. And that's why people don't like them. Simple as that. It's completely unfair, it's completely unreasonable, it's completely unrealistic, but it's fact.
I love the people that are Jews for Jesus.
Yeah, well, of course, they do need to know Jesus, but but it's a racial thing. It's not even got to do with Judaism, because they've changed that over the years. It's just racial. The Jews argued that if you want to be a Christian, it's a sect of Judaism, therefore you have to be circumcised. And that caused all sorts of problems, and if you read Galatians, that's what that's about. Peter and Paul have a major falling out over it. Because it's an external sign. Why do you need to do that? And so the early Christians have major problems over that. The Jews persecuted the Christians because they were stealing converts, I suppose. The Christians used the Jews to get an open door into places, that's good. When Paul began his mission to the Gentiles, there was a huge amount of criticism. And so Acts 15, Paul is summoned to the Council of Jerusalem. And there he is asked to explain why he's got a mission to the Jews, to the Gentiles. And the Council of Jerusalem says, yep, that's okay. And they give him permission. And it's that makes his mission travels legitimate. But the Jews are annoying. The Jews are fortunate. They are put in a position in the Roman Empire of privilege, in the sense that the Romans don't expect them to do all of the things that the Romans expect everywhere else. It's basically because they were such a nuisance. It's better to ignore them, shut them up their own, so just ignore them. If you don't understand that, you don't really understand the crucifixion. You know, Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent. And he says, why put him to death? But then he gives in. Why? Well, he gives in because of his background. You see, the Romans had agreed that when you came into Palestine, you didn't come wearing the Roman armour, the flags, all that sort of stuff. No pomp and ceremony. And Pilate decided to make a name for himself, and he came in with all the banners and all of the pomp and ceremony. And the Jews complained to the emperor. One black mark against Pilate. If he doesn't allow Jesus to be crucified, another black mark. And he can't afford that because he'll get sacked. And so he gives in, but he gives in because he's already caused trouble by not doing what the Romans were happy to allow to happen. In 66, the Jews revolted against Roman rule. And in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, including the temple, According to the historian, the Jewish historian Josephus, over 100 Jews were killed. Over 1 million Jews were killed. Now, Josephus is not always accurate with his figures. I think he probably does sort of embellish them a little bit. But anyway, he said 1 million Jews were killed. Jews were banned from entering the city of Jerusalem. And eventually they are told to get out of Palestine altogether. And so Palestine becomes the home of what became the Palestinians until in the First World War, Britain got the idea of setting up Jerusalem again as a Christian place, and in 1948 it happened, and we are still seeing the battles between the Jews and the Palestinians. And rightly so, the Palestinians say, hang on, this has been our home for 2,000 years. How dare you come and just take it over? And you say, yeah, but hang on, before that, God gave it to us, so we can, and you can't solve it. I've read book after book on it, and there is no solution. Sadly. All right, the Romans. Roman religion, first of all. The Romans accepted most religions. They were very tolerant, till you created problems like the Jews did. But otherwise, whatever you believed was fine. Christians were confused with the Jews. And so the good thing about the Jewish revolt was that Christians weren't involved in it, and so the Romans could say, oh, hang on, these people are different. The biggest problem was emperor worship. Now, we don't really get a true picture of this. Julius Caesar, when he died, was considered a god. His adopted son, who became the next emperor, Augustus, he allowed temples to be built in which he was worshipped. But that was not the standard thing. The standard thing was a Roman emperor didn't become a god and didn't get worshipped until he was dead. But then some smart Roman emperors realised that the best way to unify the empire was religion, and so Caesar worship became a big thing. Every year, you had to go to whatever and say, Caesar is Lord. Once you'd done that, that was it. It was a unifying thing. It was an attempt to remind you that you were part of the Roman Empire and Caesar was the boss. Now the problem was Christians said, hang on a minute, we can't say that. Jesus is Lord and he's the only Lord. Now, very easy to say, look, it's just symbolic, no, say it and then forget about it. And the Christians said, no, that's not the way. And so they refused to do that, and a lot of the persecution was based on precisely that. There were two other basic reasons for persecution, both from Jews and Romans. The first was that Christians were cannibals, and the second was that they were immoral. They were cannibals because they ate the body of Jesus and they drank his blood. And the service they did it at was called the agape, the love feast. So obviously there were orgies went on in there. And so the criticism was that cannibals and they're immoral. Now, when you went to a Christian meeting, if you were not a Christian or a member of the group, you left before the fellowship meal. Our prayer book still expects that. Halfway through communion, and you leave if you're not going to take communion. And it's very easy to get the wrong idea, because what do? We actually colour the glass in our windows so nobody can see inside and see what we're doing. You could be doing anything here, and the world out there wouldn't have a clue. And of course you talk about the love feast. Well, it's not a 21st century thing, it's an orgy, that's a Bible. And so Christians were criticised for those things, and in some senses they brought it on themselves because no outsiders ever saw what was happening. The Gentiles were a problem, because they had all sorts of heresies. The most important probably was Gnosticism, strong in the 2nd century, and we'll come across it in a few moments, but Probably around the New Testament times, there's a suggestion that the letter to the Colossians was written to deal with the Gnostic heresy. Now, I won't spend 2 hours on Gnosticism. I'll do it so simply, it's not funny. God is holy, we are sinful. God can have nothing to do with it. So therefore, you need to have layers between you and God. Emanations, they're called, between you and God. Now, Christians actually, who become Gnostics, Gnostic Christians, they develop that. So what do you have between you and God? You have the priest and the saints. See, that Middle-Age Christianity thing, Middle-Age in the sense of the Dark Ages, is based on Gnosticism. You go to the priest because he represents God, because you can't go to God directly. You send your prayers to the saints because they've got a sort of elevated position around the holy table. And Mary, of course, has got the best position of all, so that's why you pray to her. All of that stuff is Gnostic in its development. So Gnosticism is a problem, and we'll see it coming up over and over again. Montanus, around about 172 AD. Sorry, I should write it up. Gnosticism. Now, Montanus taught that Christ was due to return, and he taught that with prophetic enthusiasm, and he therefore wanted asceticism. You had to be ready for his return, so the idea was that you had nothing to do with the ways of the world. There was a major church split in that. Now, Montanism later on becomes the monastic movement, withdraw from the world, and it becomes the modern Christian view, where Christians just don't have anything to do with the community. You know, all their friends are Christians. All their activities are church activities. And very hard to go out and go to the pub and share the gospel or any of those things. Marcion. He was a wealthy ship owner. Having money is always helpful. He basically taught that everything Jewish was a problem. Came around about 140 AD. Fell under the spell of a Gnostic teacher. Believed that the God of the Old Testament was different to the God of the New Testament. Preached an anti-Jewish Christianity. Organised his followers into separate church in the community. He denied the humanity of Jesus. Jesus appears in Capernaum at the age of 29. He was not a real man at all. He just suddenly appeared. And all of his human experiences were apparent, not real. And so therefore you reject your body. I'll come back to that in a little while too. You rejected all of the Old Testament and the parts of the New Testament that were Jewish, which means you rejected Matthew, Mark, Acts, Hebrews, and a lot of the pastoral epistles. These are the sort of early Christian heresies that all then have a flower later on, and in actual fact, of course, are found in various ways today. Paganism. Most of the ancient world was pagan, according to what we would call it. Paganism involved polytheism, monotheism means one god, polytheism means many gods. So the ancients have many gods. Most of their gods are nature gods, which makes sense. You see, if the rain doesn't come at the right time, the crops are ruined and you starve. So therefore you make a rain god. And if the sun doesn't shine, your electricity bills go up. Sorry. The sun doesn't shine, it affects your agriculture, so you have a god of the sun. And anything natural, you have a god or a goddess. And that's why Corinth is in such trouble, because the goddess Diana, there's a temple there. And what's more natural in life than sex? So when you go to worship in that temple, you go and have sex with the temple prostitutes. Because that's part of your worship. Because it's natural. That's the sort of thing that was paganism. That's the sort of problems that the Corinthians had, because that was an acceptable part of the city, and Paul has to deal with it. Do you remember in Paul's sermon in Athens, the Areopagus or Mars Hill? As part of the sermon, he says, "Oh, I see that you're religious because I even see an altar to an unknown God." Now, there's a reason for that. 600 BC, there was a plague in Athens, and it lasted, they couldn't get rid of it. And Epimenides, a poet, he came up with a suggestion. He said, let's get a flock of sheep, take them to the top of Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and release them, and wherever they lie down to sleep, we'll sacrifice them to the god of that area. And that's what they did. But some of the sheep weren't very kind. They actually laid down to sleep in an area where there was no god attached to that area. And so they slaughtered them on the altar to an unknown god. That's the kind of religion that they had, and it was very, very significant for them. And the Christians, of course, have to deal with that. There was immorality. Because you see, the Greeks were more concerned about the mind. So you have the Stoics who say the mind is so important that you must subdue your body. So the Stoic, you break your arm, you don't cry, because your body's not important. Over against that, you have the Epicureans who say your mind is important, your body's not. So therefore it doesn't really matter what you do with your body. You want to get drunk, you want to go to orgy, that's fine as long as you keep your mind tuned. And so Rome becomes a centre of pagan feasts and drunken orgies. And Christians have to deal with that. And it's made worse by the fact that women have no place in society at all. If you are a man and you are sensible, you have a wife to look after your home and a mistress to keep you happy. That was the common view. We don't really understand that when Jesus came and the New Testament began to talk about the place of women, it was revolutionary. Absolutely revolutionary. There is neither male nor female. Women were as acceptable to God as a man was. It's revolutionary in the world of the New Testament, because that's not what they believed. And then there's persecution. Now, persecution begins with Nero and then goes right through the first 300 years. Nero was born in 37, died in 68, at the age of 30, when he committed suicide.
Yay.
His mother married the Emperor Claudius, who adopted Nero as his son and made him his heir. Historians describe him as tyrannical, self-indulgent and debauched. When he became emperor, he didn't want anybody challenging him, so he had his mother and stepbrother killed to consolidate his power, and then he had his wife killed so he could marry his lover. He was not the nicest of persons. The next slide. That's Nero, a bust of Nero, and that's a bust of Tacitus, the Roman historian. I'm not going to read ancient documents, but I'm going to read Tacitus because there is so much in it that's so important. But all human efforts of the lavish gifts and all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Rome burnt. The Great Fire of Rome. The belief was that Nero was responsible for it, because Nero wanted to rebuild Rome as a more magnificent city than it had been, so that in history people would look at it and say, wasn't Nero wonderful? And so the thing that was being said was that Nero was at the base of it. Nothing he did could change that. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most explicit tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. The most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular culture. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Now, abominable people called Christians, this is Tacitus. He doesn't like us. But no, Jesus died in the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Don't ever let anybody tell you Jesus is not historical. Here is a writer who hates Christians who tells us exactly what we know to be true. Josephus, the Jewish writer, also does that, but that's great. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. In other words, if you hadn't got rid of them all by the time it got dark, you dipped some of the ones that were left in tar, you set them up and you set light to them, and that was the light that you used to kill all the others. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle. He was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, that's us, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Okay, so that is Tacitus writing about Nero. Tacitus is no friend of the Christians. Now that persecution probably went on for almost all of the 300 years. There were periods when it wasn't there. Domitian at the end of the century is the background to the book of Revelation, almost certainly. The early 2nd century, Pliny, the governor of Bithynia, doesn't question the persecuted Christians. He wants to know what to charge them with before he puts them to death. So it's a fairly standard thing. And then by the time you get to 250, the persecutions become even worse. It's really violent under the Emperor Decius. Anyone who sacrificed to the traditional Roman gods got a certificate, and anyone who didn't get one and therefore was put to death. We don't know how many Christians were put to death under his reign. Or at the end of 260, Valerian was the emperor. The leaders were signalled out, people who worshipped the old gods, which is Christians. Church meetings were prohibited, and property was confiscated. And then under Diocletian in 303, Diocletian had a problem because his wife, his daughters, and some of his slaves were Christians. But he decreed 1, destruction of all church building, 2, confiscation of all Christian books, 3, dismissal of Christians from government and army positions, and 4, imprisonment of all clergy. And that's the end of persecution, for reasons that we should have discovered at the end of this lecture, but we won't until next week, but we'll get there. Now there were heresies that were developing new heresies. And there were four kinds of heresies that developed. The first was where you had the Bible plus other writings. Nothing new under the sun. 19th century, you get the Mormons. The Bible plus the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. Actually, nothing much in the Book of Mormon, but the other two are horrendous, and you won't get those. The Mormons don't like to give them out for that reason. I had to actually have a fight with a Mormon leader to get a copy of them. I said, your guys keep coming to my door, and they want to sell me the Book of Mormon, but when I ask them to come back with Doctrines and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price, they don't come back. What are you trying to hide? And so he gave me copies, and I know what they're trying to hide. The second is strange interpretations of the Bible. You're talking about the 2nd century. It wasn't until the 19th century that Jehovah's Witnesses came up. There is nothing new under the sun. It's weird interpretations of the Bible. The idea that we are one of many religions. This is the great heresy that's around now. Back in the 50s, when they still taught GRE in schools, General Religious Education, the Minister for Education of the day had a book written to be the basis of what you were taught, called Many Paths to One God. He got a friend to write it. The friend happened to be the chairman of the Atheist Society. And the book basically says, it really doesn't matter what religion you follow, they all take you to the one place, to God. There was such an outcry, the book was pulped. You won't find it in any libraries. And somewhere at home there is a box which has a copy of it, because I did get a copy, but much later. But you see, you hear Christians saying that now.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't matter what you believe. It's the same God. Look at how you get there. Don't you dare say Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. No, you can't say that. Or, they organised the Bible and theology to fit what they were thinking. Now, it's the end of the 18th century that rationalism and liberalism comes into play. And that, of course, is the basic thing now these days. But it's happening back in the end of the 1st century. And of course, nowadays, you know, you can actually do what you like with the Bible. Now, why did that develop? All right, well, the best book I've ever found on this period is M.A. Smith's book, From Christ to Constantine. Now, it's published by the InterVarsity Press, which means it's now out of print and disappeared forever. InterVarsity Press produced really good books, and then after a few years they removed them and replaced them with second-rate books, and then they removed those and replaced them with third-rate books. I had numerous fights on the phone with InterVarsity Press in England over this, asking that good books be kept in print. M.A. Smith, From Christ to Constantine, is gone. I had a copy which fell apart, I have to say, I'd used it so much. But I managed to find a second-hand copy which was in good condition until my dog got it off the table and it's no longer in good condition. But anyway, M.A. Smith wrote this, and I really must, next slide please, John. I love this quote. Most heresies were attempts to alter the traditional Christian faith to make it more acceptable to contemporary thought.
I love that.
He's writing about the 1st century AD, but if you said that about the church in the 21st century,
It's the same.
you'd be just as right, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the Apostolic Fathers. Thanks, John. The next slide is just a list of works of the Apostolic Fathers. They were called the Apostolic Fathers. The name didn't come into being until much later, actually, but they were called the Ante-Nicene Fathers in the 17th century. The idea was that they were all people who knew the Apostles. And since most of them weren't born until after 60 AD, that only leaves John to know, really. But anyway, that's the thought. Their writings include the first epistle of Clement and the second epistle of Clement, which was written about 50 years after his death, so it's a fake, we'll forget that one. 7 epistles of Ignatius of Antioch, the epistle of Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp, fragments of the writings of Papias of Hierapolis, only survived in the writings of later writers. We don't have any originals. One short fragment of the Apology of Quadratus of Athens, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistle to Dionysius, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Next slide, we'll look at the writers of some of those very quickly. Clement of Rome, 35 to 99. Bishop of Rome, but remember, the word is episkopos, which is overseer. When the Apostolic Fathers are translated, I should do this now. When the Apostolic Fathers are translated, they are translated by scholars of the Church, which is very strong on bishops, priests, and deacons. And so it's not surprising they always translate it as bishop. And so I'm going to use that word, but you need to know that I have no faith that that's what they meant by it. The word is episkopos, and it probably just means overseer or leader. Clement supposedly was the 4th bishop of Rome, after Peter, Linus and Anacletus. I didn't know that Charlie Brown's dog Linus was, but their friend Linus was a bishop, but anyway, apparently was. According to later writers, he was consecrated by Peter. Well, you know what I think of that. We know most about him from Irenaeus. He's not up there, he's different. He's a writer from later on. He's a bishop of Lyons in France, about 177, and only 2 of his writings remain. He defended Christianity against Gnostics. Jesus died to save us, that's important. The New Testament fulfills the Old. Jesus was fully man and fully God. That's great. But the church was responsible for interpreting the Bible. That's not so good. That's the view of the Apostolic Fathers. The church determines what the Bible says. Still the Roman Catholic view today. Church tradition is what matters. It's the view here in this diocese. We keep getting letters from the bishop about, this is an important tradition which we've never heard of the damn thing. It comes from one of these writings. It's really quite amazing. But anyway, the Epistle of Clement. So I mentioned that simply to mention that he is a writer writing about this. The first epistle was written about 96. It's the oldest Christian epistle not in the New Testament. Quotes numerous New Testament books and deals with the continuing problems at Corinth. Apparently Paul didn't solve those problems. Corinth continued to be a pain in the backside. Second epistle, as I said, was a fake. It's probably a sermon or a homily based on his writings, but not written by him. Ignatius of Antioch was the bishop or the leader of Antioch, 35 to 110. Again, it would have been a young man when Peter and Paul were still around. Suggested he knew John. He wrote a series of letters en route to his martyrdom in Rome. Topics included ecclesiology, church structure, sacraments, the role of the bishops, and the Sabbath. He was the first one to clearly identify the order of bishops, priests, and deacons. Polycarp of Smyrna, Bishop of Smyrna, now in Turkey, supposed to have known John. His big claim to fame was he tried to get the West to celebrate Easter on the Eastern Day. We'll go into that later. It becomes a huge problem later on. Papias of Hierapolis, 60 to 130, Bishop of Hierapolis, which is what is now Kirkaldy in Turkey. If you go to visit Gallipoli, you normally will cross the water there at Kirkaldy. He wrote an exposition of the sayings of the Lord, 5 volumes. All of them lost. A couple of excerpts, but that's all. So we don't know what he said really. Quadratus of Athens, died in 129. He was famous because he wrote an apology. An apology is a defence. It's not an apology in our sense. He wrote a defence of Christianity, which was read to the Emperor Hadrian. The Didache, we have no date for that. We don't know who wrote it. Didache means teaching, and it's probably the first written catechism. That's what people think. It was lost. It was rediscovered as part of other documents in the 19th century. The Shepherd of Hermas, 2nd century, written in Rome, 5 visions, 12 mandates, 10 parables. Now, not much there, except that is the basis of most Roman Catholic doctrine. It is the basis of most of the heresies that occurred in the Middle Ages. And it is the basis of Catholic and High Church Anglican teaching today. And it's not based on much at all, as you can see. We may not even get to the 2nd century anyway. 2nd century worship, let's have a look at that. Have we got that shown, please? Justin Martyr, from 100 to 165. Again, most of his writings have been lost. Only 3 survive, but it includes an account of worship sometime in the middle of the 2nd century. Baptism, when it occurred, was a prelude to worship. You're given instructions. The 3rd century had 3 years of instructions, but in Justin Martyr's day it wasn't anything like that. Congregation and the candidates fast before the service. Fasting is very important. I haven't read it yet, but there's the latest newsletter from the University of Sydney has an article by the medical faculty on why fasting doesn't produce the good things it's supposed to. One day I'll read it and see what it says. The baptism occurred at the river, or in a bathhouse, or in a house which had a bath. They then came to the congregation. There was prayer, and they greeted each other with a kiss, the holy kiss, which was to show friendship. So the holy kiss is, for us, is translated as shaking hands.
We don't even do that.
Or under COVID, bumping elbows or some sort of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all it was. Followed by a fellowship meal. When there was no baptism, which was most Sundays, it began with Bible readings. Prophets and the Gospels were most popular. And then preaching. The man in charge, Justin, called the president. He's quite strong on that. Not the bishop, but the president. They pray standing, which is the Jewish way of praying. A cup of wine mixed with water and a loaf of bread are brought in. There's a prayer of thanksgiving, which is extempore. The church leader prays it, probably the same prayer every week, but there's no set form for it. The deacons, the servants, distribute the bread and wine. Now, the bread and wine is sanctified by prayer. So we don't know from Justin Martyr whether at that stage there is already a suggestion that maybe it's more than just a memorial. Maybe that prayer sanctifies it and becomes some form of body and blood. We just don't have enough information on that. But the meal is such that the leftovers are taken away and distributed to those in need. Right? They don't have to be washed in soapy water and wiped up and whatever other rubbish the bishops come up with that we've got to do. And the bread, well, here, we just give it to me to take home to the chooks. My daughter, when she looks after the animals, has been known to tell her friends that she feeds the chooks leftover Jesus, but that's not very nice. But you see, you know, there's no special significance. If there is some sort of presence, real presence, suggested in Justin Martyn's day, it's still distributed amongst the poor. So we don't know. All of those things we'll look at next week when they actually develop. Then you have another group of teachers who are called the apologists. Justin Martyn's one of those, but there's a whole lot, and I won't go into all of them. The apologists, however, are very important because the first thing to say about the apologists is they are all Greek, not Jewish. And that is very, very important. Apology means a speech in defence of. Their arguments advance Christianity amongst the Gentiles because the Jewish documents didn't mean anything to them. Now, a lot of people don't understand that. I'll tell you that I do. Because when I was in college, we had as an Old Testament lecturer, Bill Dumbrell. Bill Dumbrell was fluent in 13 or 14 languages.
Wow.
Most of the Middle Eastern languages which are dead, so he could read the original documents. Bill Dumbrell, one year I remember him telling me he decided to learn modern Italian. And a few weeks into it, he decided the Italian culture was so good he'd learn how to play the piano as well so he could play the music. That was his year. He's going to learn Italian and play the piano. You know, and the mind is just, people like that are unbelievable. But anyway. Now, here's the problem. We are Gentile, we are Greek thinkers. So we argue 1, A, B, C, 2, A, B, C, D, 3, A, B, and so on. Bill Dumbrell lectured and preached according to the Middle Eastern technique. And that means you start here, and you go around, and you go around, and you go around, and you end up here. Half the students at college, every lecture Bill Dumbrell had called "That's an hour I'll never get back," because they didn't understand a bit of what he was saying. Those of us who knew what he was saying had worked out what was happening. He was arguing the Middle Eastern way. And he waited till about here before you even took a note. Because by the time you got to here, he covered it all 2 or 3 times, and here you sat down and you wrote your notes, because you knew where he was going. I remember at parish having some Sundays off when Bill Dumbrell was the visiting preacher, and I would sit there listening to the sermon thinking, this is incredible. I mean, the awe of this man, his interpretation was just amazing. And then over coffee, people would be saying, what on earth was he talking about? You didn't understand a word he said. Because that's not the way we think. Okay. That's what happened with the apologists. You see, they suddenly started to write theology this way, not this way. And it started to make sense to the Gentile Christians. So, next slide. All right, we'll look at a few of them. Quadratus, only one fragment survives, but I put him up there because he's interesting. He says when he was a boy, he met people that Jesus had healed. So he says there are still people walking around when I was a boy that Jesus had healed. The letter to Diognetus, we don't know who wrote it. One manuscript survives. But it's an interesting argument. It says, Christian behaviour is evidence of Christian faith. Christians don't get involved with the evils of this world, and the reason that they don't is because of their faith, and so their behaviour is evidence of their faith. Get that in James's letter, don't you? Well, faith without works is dead. Show me your faith, I'll show you my works. Works is the evidence of faith. We've got a sermon series coming up on that, so we'll get to that later. I think actually I'm doing one of those, so I better not go too much at this stage. I have nothing to preach on.
I'll hear it again.
Aristides comes from Athens. Let me tell you everything we know about Aristides. Justin Martin will go on to at this point. We don't know anything else, but I put him up there just in case you come across mention of him. Justin Martin, we've already looked at a little bit. He was born in Samaria. Interesting story. He was a student of Platonism. Plato was the great Greek philosopher. And he was a good student. Very bright boy, Justin Martin. He went to Ephesus, where he fell into a dialogue with an old man. And the old man bamboozled him with what he was saying. And at the end of the dialogue, when Justin Martyr, this great philosopher, had shown he didn't really have any answers, the old man said, why don't you base your philosophy on the scriptures? Justin Martyr took him seriously and went to the scriptures with great enthusiasm. We only have 3 of his manuscripts that survived, but we know he was very influential. We've looked at a little bit on worship, but some of his other ideas were very, very influential. Tatian was a student of Justin Martyr. He said everything that's not Christian is evil. That's gone a little bit far. Everything that is not Christian is evil. Athenagoras, he was an Athenian philosopher who wrote a treatise on the resurrection. Theophilus, he wrote 3 books defending the faith. Melito, the bishop of Sardis, wrote an apology, a defence to the Christian emperor Marcus Aurelius. So they are the main apologists. Very important because they turn the Christian argument into something that the Gentiles can understand. Now, towards the end of the 2nd century, Ignatius, the bishop of, Irenaeus rather, the bishop of Wyong in Gaul, maybe that's the next slide, I'm not sure if you want to try it and see it. Yes, it is, yep, okay. He wrote 5 books against the Gnostic heresies in his area, thoroughly biblical and very important. Tertullian was born about 150 in the province of Africa. He was converted at the age of 40. Most of the books he wrote are lost. So if I tell you 31 survived, you'll understand how many he wrote. He was quite prolific. He wrote to show the absurdity of persecution of Christians. He was the first to use the term Trinity and give details. The term had been used before, but the idea of the Trinity owes itself to him. So we are talking about the Trinity coming into being with Tertullian, who was born in 150. It's just a systematization of what the Bible says, and up until that time the doctrine hadn't really occurred to most people. He was the first Christian to write in Latin, so many of the terms that we use, like sacraments for example, Tertullian actually introduced because he was writing in Latin. 3 great interests. Christianity's attitude to the Roman state and to society, the defence of orthodox beliefs, actually 4. The moral development of behaviour of Christians. So Christians' attitude to the Roman state and society, very important. Defence of orthodox beliefs, even more important. The moral behaviour of Christians makes a good laugh. Very much written for his day, has nothing to do with us. He developed the doctrine of the Trinity. In the 3rd century, Asia Minor declines. Asia Minor has been the centre of the church. Let me try and get through where I got to on Monday. I'm obviously more long-winded today because we're not in Alexandria we had the most important teaching centre. So the next slide. Pantaenus. He was the foundation of an instruction program. No copies survive, but he had a systematic teaching program which was very important in building the church in Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria, not Clement of Rome, Clement of Alexandria was born in Athens, converted in midlife. He taught that Christianity was superior to Greek philosophy. He was very influential as a teacher. Origen, very significant, 185 to 253. Born in Alexandria, lived and studied in great poverty, but was one of the great Christian scholars in antiquity. He settled in Palestine after disagreement with the Bishop of Alexandria, a man after my own heart. And now we have problems because everything's out of order. Whoops. All right, okay. Origen was helpful in that Ambrose, who was a wealthy convert from Gnosticism, paid for copyists, which is why we have so much of his writing and why it's so influential. Now the other thing to say about Origen, this is very important, he is considered the father of orthodoxy and the father of heresy. So choose which pages you want to read. That's the bottom line there. Let me finish with the New Testament, and we'll go home there and start the 3rd century next week. And we might get to Constantine next term. No, we'll get to it. The New Testament, next slide please, John. We have to understand how we got the New Testament because it didn't just turn up. In 200 AD, the Muratorian canon, the 4 Gospels, the Acts, and then Paul's letters, James 1 and 2, John, Jude, Revelation of John, Revelation of Peter, Wisdom of Solomon, and the Shepherd of Hermas, which you could read in private, wasn't to be read in the church. In 250, we have the New Testament Origen used. Thanks, John. Now, Origen has 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters. He's not sure about James or 1 and 2 John or Jude or the Revelation of Peter or the Wisdom of Solomon. He doesn't want the Shepherd of Hermas at all. And he has real question marks about Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, Shepherd of Hermas, letter of Barnabas, teaching of the 12 apostles, and the Gospel of Hebrews. Next slide. We go to 300 AD and the New Testament used by Eusebius. New Testament is the 4 Gospels, the Acts, Paul's letters. James is disputed. We're not sure about James. We're not sure about 2 and 3 John. We're not sure about Jude. We don't want anything to do with any of these others. They've all gone. Now, the basis for that is, who wrote the document? Was it written by an apostle? The Revelation of John gets in there because they think it was John the apostle, but they're not sure. James, 2 and 3 John, and Jude are all, they're not certain. We move on to 400, and in 400 we have the New Testament as we know, fixed by the Council of Carthage. It's not that it hasn't been disputed since then, it has. Luther, for example, left out the letter of James because he said it's not Christian. It's different. It really is different. We're doing a series on James coming up, and you'll see how different it is. Hebrews makes it, hasn't been in any of the previous ones. It makes it because the assumption is it was written by Paul. So if you've got an authorised version, you'll see it says the Apostle of Paul, the Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews. Now let me tell you, the one thing we know for sure is Paul didn't write it. The authorised version has it there because that's the justification for being there. We don't know who wrote it. But it wasn't Paul because the grammar is not Paul's grammar. And the subject matter is not stuff that interested Paul either. It's legitimate because probably whoever wrote it was part of that period, and I have no problem accepting it. It's actually a brilliant book, fantastic book. But they made it, put it in there because it was supposed to be by Paul. It's 400 before we have the New Testament as we know it. It's very important. Now most of it there was never any doubt about, but some of it was disputed. So from 400 on, the church is using the same Bible, although of course there is now a problem with the Old Testament. You have the books that the Jews accepted, and then you have the books that the Jews didn't accept, which we call the Apocrypha. They were the books written between the end of the prophetic period, 400 BC, and the coming of Jesus. And they are printed in Catholic Bibles because some Catholic doctrine, like purgatory, comes from those books. Anglicans are told that they are good for your edification, but they are not part of Scripture. That's part of the 39 Articles. They are worth reading because there's some good history there. There's also some very weird stuff, but that's another story. So even today we're not really agreed. We're all agreed on what's in the New Testament, but now we have some divisions over the Old Testament. All right, we come to the 3rd century, and I better let you go at this point because you've had enough and I've had enough. We come to the 3rd century. We'll deal with that fairly quickly, and then we'll go on to the 4th century, and in particular Constantine, who